Hello and welcome to Why Medics Matter, a podcast for doctors, by doctors, brought to you by Doctors Training. We are your hosts. I'm Dr. Amy Burbridge.
And I'm Dr. Simon Fraser.
Thank you so much for everybody who's listening for joining us today. And even better, we are joined by the fantastic Dr. Jess Morgan. Jess is a paediatrician. She's a facilitator at Doctors Training and engagement lead. And I've known Jess for about 6 to 7 months now. And it's great that she's joining us on today's podcast. So, Jess, could you just tell us a little bit, I guess, about yourself and why you're here today?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me on the podcast. It's really exciting. So I am a paediatrician. I worked clinically for 11 years in the NHS. And I've more recently, over the last few years, moved into the medical education space, obviously working with you both at Doctors Training. And I also am very active in the wellbeing space. I do a lot of sort of talking, teaching and writing around doctors' mental health, how we can improve culture and improve the working lives of doctors, essentially. But my career looks very, very different to how I expected it to when I started med school at the age of 18. I was always very career-driven, very ambitious, very conscientious, and saw myself as a clinical paediatrician forever. And then life happened, and I had some really big decisions to make. And I think I had probably 4 or 5 years, which were quite challenging, and we can talk about that in a little bit more detail. But it's left me in a place where my career does look different, but I am actually still incredibly fulfilled. I get a lot out of what I do now, even though it does look very different.
Just to touch, I guess, a little bit on, you mentioned that when you were 18, you go to medical school and we have our paths are set out for us. We're going to work in the NHS as a doctor, as a jobbing clinician. And anything outside of that, I guess, is just, we're sort of labelled as being different and not conforming. And that's really difficult. And you mentioned that you had some difficult decisions to make. Could you just, I guess, talk us through those a little bit?
Yeah, so I think you're right. There's this culture in medicine where our careers are very linear. The training pathways are set. And I was somebody who knew from very, very early on that I wanted to do paediatrics. And so I therefore got on the conveyor belt and I did what I needed to do. And I got a lot of worth and validation from that, you know, jumping through hoops, winning prizes, getting things published. And that's what came to define me. I was on paper this, excellent trainee. But it's really hard to keep that up. And I had children, life got more complicated. I continued to plow all of my energy into work and it just wasn't sustainable. And so I properly crashed and burned in a heap and developed burnout. And that then sort of tipped into mental illness. And it got to a point really where I realized I had to make some big decisions. I ended up being signed off sick, and that in itself was a very, very difficult thing to have to accept. But then, a bit like what you said, Amy, like when you no longer fit the mold, when you no longer fall into the sort of typical benchmark of what a doctor should look like, and you realize that actually you want to look after your own health, there comes a point where you say, right, things have to change. And so I had to look at what I was able to do at that point in time, what I wanted for myself, for my family, for my health, and for my career, and think, okay, well, what's right for me now? And make that decision. What's right for me now is not what's right for me in 10 years' time. It's what I need in that moment in order to take some time out and step away and recover. And that's what I did.
To make that step, though, that you made, that I need a break, I need to take time off work, that is probably one of the bravest things that you have done. Because it's really difficult to, I guess, just go, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah, it is. And it was incredibly hard. And if I'm completely honest, I didn't make the decision. So two things happened. Firstly, my supervisor sat me down with a cup of tea and he said, look, Jess, I'm really, really sorry. I need to label you. And I thought, right, okay, what's going on here? And he said, I really want to get you the support that you deserve. And in order to do that, I need to label you as a trainee in difficulty, because that is what happens. That is the process that will then allow us to access the support through the deanery. And in those 3 words, I literally, like, my world fell apart, because there is a huge amount of stigma around the terminology that we use. Actually, he showed a huge amount of compassion and he was absolutely brilliant. But I think the language we use matters, because what happened there is I felt othered. I felt like I was being put in a box with a whole load of other people that were navigating difficult times. But because in that moment, he gave me permission. He said, Jess, I want to help you. We need to find a way to lift the pedal. Let's look at all of the different things that you're doing and what really matters. I couldn't do that for myself at that point in time. My brain was fog. And so having him be able to identify where I could use my energy was really, really helpful. And then the second thing that happened is my psychiatrist signed me off. So at that point, I didn't have the choice. It was obviously a conversation, but in the midst of burnout and mental illness, I no longer had the capacity to look after myself. I was going to plow on, keep going. I needed somebody to make that decision for me.
When you were building up to that meeting with your educational supervisor, he sounds amazing and handled it in a great way. Did you know that something wasn't right?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that didn't come out of the blue. I had had many conversations in the run up to that with my supervisor. I had a mentor at the deanery and things. I think it is really difficult to reach out and ask for help and say, I'm finding things really difficult. And one of the things that I talk about quite a lot now is that as a resident doctor, you often think that person has to be your supervisor because there is this hierarchy. But actually, not everybody has that kind of relationship with their supervisor. And what you really need is an ally. It's just somebody who's got your back, somebody who you can go to at work and just say, do you know what? I know I'm not the best version of myself at the moment. I know I'm not performing to my very best. My brain is clouded by, fog. I can't concentrate. I can't sleep, whatever it might be. Someone that's just got your back and can say, hey, let's have a chat. And that doesn't have to be your supervisor. Not initially.
It can be
anyway.
anyone.
It can be anyone.
Yeah.
Because what you need in that moment is humanity. The process comes later, and obviously there is a process, but what you need at that point where you disclose and you reach out for help is you need a human to respond.
Yeah, I guess it's kindness, isn't it? Kindness and compassion, and actually anyone should be capable of being able to help you with that at work. There'll be lots of people listening to this who may be struggling. What did burnout look like for you?
I think that's a really great question because we often don't know, we don't label it.
Exactly.
So I was a very, very empathic doctor. I think probably empathy, communication skills were probably my best attributes and would always come out in, MSFs and stuff. But what's really interesting was as I was becoming more and more burnt out, all of the empathy was replaced with this real bitterness and cynicism. And I was really angry that patients were turning up to the assessment unit. Everything felt completely pointless, completely purposeless. I was just like, what is my role here? Why am I even here? I've got nothing to add. Nothing's going to change. And what I really noticed was that my negativity was contagious. And so because I was in such a negative space, that was spreading to the people around me. I can't describe the exhaustion. The exhaustion is not anything that I have ever experienced before. I mean, I was falling asleep at traffic lights and still coming into work. That is terrifying. And I'm very, very grateful that nothing bad ever happened from a sort of patient safety point of view. But if we think of it, there's huge amounts of evidence that burnout is, associated with worse patient outcomes. And it's no surprise, really. But despite all of that, I didn't see it as burnout. I saw it as I can't cope with a job that everybody else can cope with. And actually what would have been really helpful is for somebody to say, Jess, I know you and you're not really yourself at the moment. This is what I'm noticing. And I wonder if you're burnt out. I wonder if this is burnout. Because I think there's something about labeling it that takes the blame away.
Jess, firstly, just thank you for sharing some very, very sensitive and valuable insights and being vulnerable here with us. You mentioned you needed somebody to come in and help label this and stuff. And you had that despite exhaustion, despite cynicism, despite feeling you're not adding value. What is it that keeps doctors turning up? We know doctors do this. We will never admit we're sick and we will turn up. Why? Help me understand that if we can.
So there were two things for me. And I think that's a really valid conversation. There were intrinsic drivers for me personally, and then there was stigma. And so if we kind of take both of those in turns. So the intrinsic drivers for me, I didn't know this at the time, really. I'm much better at articulating what my values are and what my purpose is now. But looking back, the things that I was craving and that I was going to work for were teaching medical students. And that was one of the things that was contributing to breaking me. And I was also setting up a regional mentor scheme. So that was the other thing that I did not want to let go, because they are two of my biggest passions. I was connecting with people and I was teaching. And so when my supervisor sat me down and said, Jess, let's lift the pedal, those were the things that he was going to have to remove, because actually they weren't my clinical training. That was what I really needed to focus on. So the point at which those got removed, I then completely crumpled in a heap, because I no longer had the things that gave me meaning and purpose. So that's me and what was kind of driving me to continue. But then in the background, there is this undercurrent of mental health stigma in the NHS, in medicine across internationally, where this culture of stoicism that starts from as early as med school, where we believe that we have to just cope with the job because everybody seems to be doing that. And so that's what you do. You put on a face, you go to work, even if you're feeling awful, whether that's physically or mentally. And so that's what I did. And, I turned up with a smile. I mean, I don't really talk about this. I'm not sure I've ever spoken publicly about this, but there was a certain point when I was on medication that I was getting up to change my pajamas 4 times in the night because I was sweating so much. I was so stressed. I wasn't sleeping. And yet my alarm would go off at 6:30 and I would get up and I would go to work with a smile, because I did not want to admit that I was weak or that I was failing in some way. And so I think that, unfortunately, was the bigger drive that made me carry on.
Thank you, Jess, for sharing that. And I'm sure that it resonates with a lot of people, actually, those intrinsic drivers and those extrinsic drivers. And I guess what really hits home is when you talk about the stigma, and the stigma is shame. And it's okay to not go to work with a broken arm, for example, because you can't work because you've got a broken arm, because somebody can see the broken arm. But when your mind is broken or when your mental health is broken, it's almost like, just pull yourself together, just get on with it, just go to work, for God's sake, it's fine. And then you feel that it's okay to go to work and you have to keep getting up every day and you have to go to work. And you become more and more unwell until it gets to a point where you can't work, and nobody's benefited really from that. And you mentioned that there was somebody there behind you, your supervisor, who sort of pointed out to you need to take some time off and you were signed off. If there are doctors out there who are listening who feel like this, what can they do?
Yeah, I'm really glad that you asked that, because I think that is the really important part of this conversation, is that there might well be people listening who go,
Exactly.
Oh my gosh, this is me. And firstly, that is okay. I spent years and years thinking that I was alone. I had actually carried a history of mental illness since I was a teenager, and I hid that. I didn't tell anybody because I thought I was on my own. And then once I accessed help and support, I realized that there is a whole service called NHS Practitioner Health that exists because health professionals get sick. This is an NHS funded service. It would not exist if this was not a thing. And so, firstly, you are not alone. That is number one. Secondly, it is not weakness. It is simply humanity. And that there's this amazing quote that's something along the lines, I'm paraphrasing now, but to expect people to bear witness to the pain and suffering of our patients and not be touched emotionally by it is like expecting people to walk through water without getting wet. And that's so true. There is a real inherent vulnerability in being a health professional, and we don't acknowledge that. So this is not weakness. And then thirdly, I would say, goes back to that point we were discussing at the beginning about finding an ally, finding one person that you feel able to have that conversation with, and just dare to be human, dare to be vulnerable, in the knowledge that there are a lot of myths that are not true. So the GMC have never been involved. The GMC do not know that I was unwell. They did not need to know that I was unwell. There were never any patient safety concerns. So one of the big things for me was that, oh my gosh, the GMC will find out if anybody knows that I was burnt out, if anybody, I thought I would be struck off. That's a complete myth. So let's draw a line under that now. Yes, obviously there are cases where fitness to practice does become something that needs to be considered, but in the vast majority of cases, it doesn't. The concept that my career would be decimated, and that if anybody found out, they would think that I was, a shell of who I used to be. Well, yes, things were difficult. Yes, my career looks very different now, but actually, I'm still working. I still can call myself a doctor. I'm just using my skills in a different way. And if I wanted to return to clinical medicine, I could do. I've chosen not to. So, yeah.
Okay. So NHS Practitioner Health, you mentioned, are an incredible help. For trainees out there, apart from the educational supervisor, we often get trainees who we can see are struggling. As a supervisor, I can see trainees who are struggling. Put yourself back in the position of being that trainee. What's the best thing that I can do to support that trainee in that situation?
So I think there's two things that need to happen before you even sit with that trainee. So firstly, you need to understand what services are available locally. So do that work yourself. What is it that the deanery offers? What is it that your organisation offers? And who are the people within your department that you know are lovely people? Do that work yourself. Secondly, do some internal work and ask yourself some really serious questions about your own biases. And what are you bringing to this conversation? How are you perceiving this? And what are you going to judge and think? And because we all do it, I will hold my hand up and, and so when you are then sitting with that trainee, you are then in a position where you can actually connect with them and hear what it's like for them, even if you've not experienced it. Or maybe you have experienced something, but you're hearing their version of it. And I think that's really important because actually, I could say, oh, yeah, you sound like you're really struggling. I remember when I struggled, oh yeah, this was what I needed. So this is therefore what you'll need. And actually that's not the case. Really listening to understand is thinking, okay, your experience is different to mine. What can I do to support you? But I think if I look back to, so I had two amazing supervisors. One was at the time where I went off sick, and then one was at the time when I returned to medicine. So I went back after being signed off sick I had nearly a year off work, and I went back for a year before I left medicine completely. And during that time, there were three things I think that my supervisor did. So firstly, she signposted me. Secondly, she had an open door that was literally, it was never about going in to do a portfolio review. It was, my door is always open, Jess, come whenever you need to. Bearing in mind that at this point in time, the idea of taking a history from a patient was really overwhelming, I would go into her office and burst into tears. And rather than try to fix it, she would just sit with me. And that is pretty special, because that's what I needed. And then the third thing that she did was she became my advocate. So when you are in the throes of burnout, of mental illness, or when you've got a lot on your plate, it can be very difficult to navigate systems. And having somebody to do some of that for you or with you is really powerful, and actually A, makes you feel less alone, and B, gives you a voice where you maybe didn't have one before. So I think those things, do some personal work, think about your biases, think about what services are available locally, keep your door open, and advocate.
Okay. Thank you so much for sharing that. And again, the advocate really resonates actually when you mentioned that. I was like, yeah, of course, we need to advocate, and we need to advocate for ourselves as well, don't we?
Jess, can I pick up, because clearly you're incredibly passionate about sharing your story, put the spotlight on these challenges. You talk about advocacy. I wonder if you'd be happy to share some of the work you've done over the last few years as an advocate, the different organizations you've worked with, because this is a real passion of yours, and it's sort of turning that into good, and how you raise the profile, tackle stigma. Would you share some of your passion with the audience?
Yeah, of course. So while I was off sick, my husband basically said, "Oh, Jess, you should start a vlog, because you always say you don't want people to feel alone." And I thought, I can't write, don't be silly. But I started this vlog, and at the same time I started a Twitter account. And initially, genuinely, it was aimed at helping one person feel less alone. And over a number of years, I just shared my story. I shared the reality of being a doctor with a mental health condition, or experiencing burnout, and my return to medicine and some of the challenges. And slowly that account snowballed, and I kind of ended up with 24,000 followers, which is insane because it's just little old me behind my phone. But actually what people saw in that account was a human. And I think it's that vulnerability with which I share my story that people resonate with, and they kind of see themselves, not in the whole story, but in parts of it. And they go, gosh, yeah, I connect with that. Wow, maybe it's okay to talk about this. And so on the back of that, I've then been invited to kind of speak at various events. And I'm an ambassador for Doctors in Distress, which is an amazing charity that supports the mental health of health professionals. They run a weekly support group. They do a lot of fundraising and lobbying and things. So all of this stuff that I now do, even what I do with you guys at Doctors Training, none of this would have happened had I not been unwell, which is kind of weird, but also kind of awesome. I think it's like you can turn adversity into, growth.
And thinking about, I'm more interested in you now. I think about growth, because you have had a very powerful story that resonates with a lot of audience, but this is just a fraction of you. So if people wanted to know what's next for Jess and what motivates you and drives you and inspires you, tell me a bit more, because I know there's much more to you than just this story.
So I am first and foremost a wife and a mum. So I have two kids who are 11 and 9, and they are like my number one. I love open water swimming and being in the outdoors, and so those things now feature at the top of my who am I. before they would not have even been mentioned. So I introduced myself before as Jess, I'm a paediatrician, and that was my life. And now they are number one. I love writing. I am in a choir. Those things are up there, and they are things that I want to be doing forever. What gives me a kind of kick and an energy is people. It's connecting with people and having a sense of belonging and connection. And I think in some ways, whatever I do down the line in 10 years, I can't tell you what I'll be doing in 10 years, but whatever it is will involve people, because that's just how I get my energy. Teaching, we haven't really talked about my sort of brief interlude into primary teaching, which is in many ways a little bit random, but also amazing. But I bring now a certain creativity to medical education, I think. And so I would love that to remain part of my portfolio going forward. But I think you're right. I think it is, my story doesn't define me. My story has shaped me. And I see today, this podcast, tomorrow, everything as a part of the journey. I genuinely used to have my career mapped out, and I do not have anything mapped out now. Like, it is just a meandering, convoluted journey to goodness knows where, but hopefully it'll be good.
And that's okay, which is what's brilliant about this and hearing your story, is that, you know, we have, if we just go back to the beginning, when at 18 we have like a very mapped out journey, don't we? Go to medical school and you become a doctor and a consultant or whatever it is. But the fact that you've sort of jumped off that, left medicine, and now got this incredible career ahead of you, who knows what it is? And that's great. That's wonderful. There's so much ahead of you that's exciting and different. And you wouldn't have had that, like you said, if we'd stayed on that NHS conveyor belt, which is okay for many people. But sometimes it's not okay for people, and that's okay too.
Yeah, and I think that's the key, really, is that it's not for everybody. And I don't want to be disingenuous, because there was a time where I really wanted to go back to clinical medicine, and it's been very difficult. There's no real path for returning to clinical medicine once you're out. There's no funding nationally. So it's been really difficult. And again, there have been some very emotional, quite traumatic decisions that I've had to make in the last year to not return to clinical medicine. And so I am in this space now that I really love. It's not been easy. And it would be dishonest to make out that this is all easy and I've got this amazing career. It's a wonderful opportunity that I've got. I've got some great fulfillment and joy from what I do in all the various different aspects of my career. But it's also been hard. And so I want to just say that, because I think for anybody who's listening who thinks, oh, it's really easy, you can just jump ship and I'll just jump ship and rah, rah, rah. It's not that it's just been easy. There have been difficult decisions.
And Jess, you talked about challenges and your priorities have changed. You know, you know, and I think a lot of people, and I've been for that journey, it was always, I was doctor clinical first, and then there was my interest, and there was a family, and it's really hard to switch that balance and stuff. And I know you love your work, you're passionate about what you do, and it's easy to get sucked back into that drive for success and succeeding. What checks and balances do you have in place that keep you rounded, that you could maybe share with other people listening?
Oh gosh, I feel like this is a test. So this is the bit where I have to be really honest.
And I'm taking notes.
Yeah. No, this is the bit where I have to be really honest. So it is an everyday check. I have to keep myself in check, because I do get really passionate about my work. I do, particularly when it's around well-being, when it's around improving the working lives of doctors. I can just run with it. And so number one is boundaries. And so I try really, really hard to not check my emails, after a set time in the evening. I've taken work emails off my phone. Work WhatsApp groups are absolutely terrible for my mental health, so I really try not to use them. I have an out of office on my email. So if I am going away on holiday, it will say I'm away on holiday and please don't expect to hear a reply or whatever, which I never had before. It wouldn't have occurred to me to do that. But respecting those boundaries of leave and home. I work less than full time. And so I try and respect those less than full-time days. They are there for a reason. I want to spend time with my family. I still go to therapy. I'm happy to say that. So that time is there for a reason. And previously I would work less than full-time, but I would then do my portfolio on my non-working days. I would go in and do a QI project or, actually that was terrible for me. So having those boundaries, but, everybody can set a boundary. The difficult bit is maintaining it. And I think that's where, as colleagues, we can help each other to maintain our own boundaries. So, we can be open about what works for each other. And, I can say, oh, Amy, do you know what? You told me that you wanted to leave at 5. And I've noticed that the last couple of days you've been here at 6 o'clock. And that's a friendly, that's helping. That's not telling each other off.
One of the things I've often heard people say about boundaries is I'm being selfish. And I think it's such just a wrong term. Being protected about your boundaries, not being selfish, it's about being sustainable.
Yeah.
And actually being able to turn up regularly and stuff. We get sucked into this.
Yeah, I think the other thing is there's a lot of guilt around boundaries for that exact reason, is you feel like, oh my gosh, I need to stay late. I have to stay late because XYZ is going to happen. And we often think that we're indispensable, which when I realized I wasn't indispensable is kind of a bit sad, but we're really not. And that's the harsh reality, is that life goes on without us. And so whether you stay late or not isn't really going to make that much difference. So being able to say, do you know what, actually today I am going to leave on time because I am going to go for a run. That might not seem like a priority, but that is going to do my mental health a load of good. Don't know why I just used running as an example. I hate running.
I would, looking at me. I'd be running.
Yeah, I would not do that. I would go and I would say, I'm going to
start stalking you on Strava now.
I'm not on Strava. I would say, I need to go to a coffee shop and have a coffee and a cake.
I love that. Jess, we're coming close to the end, and it's nice to finish on a positive note. But I always ask this question to all of our guests, which is, if you could, with your knowledge and experience and wisdom, go back and give your 18-year-old version some advice, what would that be?
I think I would say it's okay to just be you. Be you, and that's enough.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jess. There's a lot of food for thought there for lots of people. And, seeing how you are now is so inspiring as well. So a massive thank you for sharing your story and giving us your time.
Well, thanks for having me.
And again, Jess, I just want to finish by saying what a privilege it is to have you in the team and continue the really important work around Advocate for Mental Health. So thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you to everyone for listening. If anyone has listened to that podcast and been affected by any of the things that we talked about, please reach out to a colleague, a friend, a family member. And there's always the wonderful NHS Practitioner Health, which is a free and confidential service, as well as Doctors in Distress, which you can also find online. In the show notes, we will put some links for these services that can be accessed if needed.